J.R. Moehringer won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing in 2000. He was a Pulitzer finalist 2 years earlier for a story about a homeless boxer, a story that later became a film starring Samuel L. Jackson. He's a former national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and he now writes for a variety of publications, including GQ and ESPN.com. He's the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, The Tender Bar, which captured the hearts of booksellers, reviewers, and readers alike. And he was co-author of Andre Agassi's critically acclaimed #1 bestseller, Open. His long-anticipated debut novel, Sutton, brings to life the Babe Ruth of bank robbers. Willie, the actor Sutton, who was once so beloved in New York City that crowds chanted his name in the streets. It's sure to be one of the buzzed-about books of this fall season. Please welcome J.R. Moehringer.
Whose idea was it for me to go last? After Jimmy Fallon and Kirstie Alley and Michael Chabon. It's like Van Morrison, Alicia Keys, Sinatra, Adele, and then Gilbert Gottfried. That's how they, thank you, BEA. In all seriousness, though, I'm very honored to be here this morning, and I'm proud to be in this esteemed company and to have the chance to tell you a little bit about my book, which is a historical novel about the most interesting man in the world, to my mind, the most interesting bank robber in American history, Willie Sutton. I was having breakfast recently with my friend's 9-year-old daughter, Violet, who loves singing and ballet and horses and happens to be a genius. She's the daughter of my college roommate who's a genius, and her mother's a genius, and Violet's a little scary. She reads all the time, and she wants to be a writer, and so her ears perk up whenever she hears me and her parents talking about my book. And so this recent morning, before everyone else was awake, we were at the dining room table, and Violet said, "Uncle J.R., your book is about a bank robber from a long time ago?" And I said, yes. I was quite pleased that she knew this. She said, "Why would someone like me care about a bank robber from a long time ago?" I said, "That's an excellent question, Violet. An excellent, excellent question," which is what I say to children whenever I don't know the answer. What I say to everyone when I don't know the answer. And then she asked a follow-up. She said, "Was he a good guy or a bad guy?" I had not had any coffee at this point, so I said, "That's another excellent question. He was both." And she frowned. She really did not like that answer. Both. So she said, "Aren't you worried about making a bank robber likable?" She said, "You know, he broke the law and stuff, and aren't you worried a reader won't like him and won't want to finish the book?" To which I said, So this morning, with your indulgence, I'd like to recapture that moment and maybe tell you what I would have told Violet if I hadn't been so caught off guard. Beginning with what made me decide to write about Sutton, because, as Michael said, that's the thing that people, other than Violet the genius, typically ask you about your book. What made you decide to write this book? And that's the thing you ask yourself while writing a book. What the hell made me decide to write this book? It's so hard, and you get lost so often, that you ask the ceiling and the toaster and the dog why a lot. And I'm not sure that we ever know. Maybe we create reasons. But I think choosing a book is like choosing a mate. We want to think that there's a choice, but something else is at work, and if not fate, it's something for which we don't have a word. So for instance, back in 2008, I was finishing up helping Andre Agassi with his memoir, and I was trying to choose the subject for my next book, and I had a list of ideas. But meanwhile, the world appeared to be ending, and banks looked to be the main reason. And like all of you, I was extremely angry watching television every day. I wanted to write about that anger because everything else I thought about writing about paled in comparison to this historic moment. And I thought many times of a line from the play Threepenny Opera. What is the burgling of a bank compared to the founding of a bank? So I watched Shitty Bank and Bank of America ruining the world and wanted to write about what I saw, but I'm not Michael Lewis, much as I would like to be Michael Lewis. So I started thinking of other ways I could write about banks, and that got me thinking about people who hate banks more than me. And that got me thinking about bank robbers, which got me thinking about Willie Sutton, who used to be the face of American bank robbery. Back in the 20s through the 50s, Sutton was to bank robbers what James Bond was to spies, and what James Patterson is to books. He was freakishly prolific. He robbed scores of banks and made off with $2 million, they say, although we don't really know, which is a huge sum, obviously, in the Great Depression. And he was that rare criminal, never mind bank robber. He put together a lengthy career, which spanned 4 decades, if you can try and wrap your brain around that. Cops not only couldn't catch him, but when they caught him, they couldn't hold on to him. Good as he was at robbing banks, Willie Sutton was even better at breaking out of prisons. 3 times he escaped from escape-proof prison. The last time in 1947, he stayed free for 5 years. And though he was on the first ever FBI Most Wanted list, and though cops and feds were hunting high and low for him, he was so brazen and cocksure that he lived right here in New York City. He hung out in bars, he went to the movies, he shopped in bookstores because he was by far our most bookish intellectual criminal in American history. He had a girlfriend, and he went right on robbing banks. There was a time, because of this kind of cool, brash, cunning attitude and his success, when everyone knew Willie Sutton's name. Now I tell people I'm writing a book about Willie Sutton, I get blank looks. But my grandparents used to talk about Willie Sutton, and the men in my uncle's bar used to talk all the time about Willie Sutton, which may have something more to do with my upbringing than Willie Sutton. I allow that. But novelists used to talk about Willie Sutton, and they would compare themselves to him because he was devoted to his craft. And he worked hard at it, and he refined it, and he was an innovator. Saul Bellow, in one of my favorite novels, Herzog, goes off on a gorgeous riff about Willie the actor, Sutton. And he ends with this line, motive, the power and completeness of all human systems must be continually tested, outwitted at the risk of freedom of life. That was what Sutton represented to Bellow. He was a kind of a trickster figure. He was changing society by breaking its rules. And despite Bellow and despite all the newspaper ink devoted to Sutton in the first half of the last century, his motives were actually always a deep mystery. It wasn't just money, obviously, because he kept robbing long after he had a fortune. It wasn't just rage against the machine, because he was way more complicated than that. In my early research, I felt, and in my novel I let play out, that his motive was largely a woman, his first love, Bess, whom he wrote about in both of his memoirs, wrote about with longing and melancholy and tenderness. And then both his memoirs, even though they're largely fiction, they're the most beautiful embroidered lies. And to my mind, he's the only person in all of American literature who wrote 2 memoirs that completely contradict each other, even on basic biographical details. Even though, having said all that, Bess was very real. She existed. She's right there in the old newspaper clips, because Bess Endner was more than Willie Sutton's first love. She was also his first accomplice. And she was bad. She was bad to the bone. Few of us, I think, could have resisted Bess Endner. Every newspaper account commented on her beauty and her powers of allure, and a poor skinny kid from Brooklyn, born in 1901, in the Irish town slums between the 2 bridges, didn't have a chance when she led him by the hand into a life of crime. So here was Sutton, this rogue, this romantic, this lover, liar, reader. He was a fantastic dancer, one of the great antagonists banks had ever known. And there was a love story at the heart of his psyche. So I was already 90% decided to write this book. But then the coup de grace, I learned that when he finally got out of prison for good, pardoned on Christmas Eve, 1969, there was such a frenzy for the first interview with a figure who once loomed larger than Capone that 2 newspaper journalists scooped him up outside Attica and kept him, held him, whisked him around New York City for 24 hours, and made him tell them about his greatest heists and escapes and heartbreaks so that they could have the exclusive story. I mean, the idea that there was a time when newspapers not only mattered but could kidnap people is fills me with such nostalgia. And so Sutton was in the backseat of this car, and the two journalists were driving him around, and it was so nefarious and weird and noir, and it actually happened. And the story was not very good. It was flat, which means something happened in that car. Either Willie was holding back, anticipating that he was going to write a memoir, or he was driving them crazy, or it was Christmas and they were drunk from the newspaper Christmas party. But so I could imagine that day in the car, that 24-hour period, with Sutton telling them about his life being the perfect way for me to tell the story of his life. It helped also that everyone at this moment that I was deciding to write about Sutton was quoting Willie Sutton. Asked why he robbed banks, Willie Sutton is supposed to have said, because that's where the money was. And even people who don't know El Duco about Sutton know that line. And in 2009, it was everywhere during the financial meltdown because it's shorthand for greed, for political corruption, and sometimes it's used just to explain anything for which the answer is duh. And I'd heard that line a lot as a kid, and now I started hearing it again. To my grandparents and the men in my uncle's bar, that line was witty, and that meant that Sutton was the first witty bank robber. And that mattered to them. He was like Robin Hood by way of Jackie Gleason, straight out of Bay Ridge. And sure, he robbed banks, and that wasn't good, wink, wink, but he was Irish and a swell dresser, and he gave lots of money away, and he read good books, and he never hurt anybody. He never fired a single shot in his 40-year career as a bank robber. So in fact, I wanted to call the book Nobody Gets Hurt because that's what Sutton said when he stuck up banks. Over there, open the safe, nobody gets hurt. And that seemed to be his creed. He only hurt banks. He didn't hurt ordinary people. He only tested the limits of society. But I sort of forgot that that's the same self-justification used by the money guys and the bankers, that it's America. You know, you can't wait for someone to give you something. You got to reach out and take it. You got to grab the brass ring. Everybody does it, and all those crass banalities are so wrong because, of course, we're all connected. And that's what I was forgetting as I was starting to mythologize Willie Sutton in the early part of my research. When I really began reading about Sutton and memorizing his memoirs, I discovered that, yes, he was committed to nonviolence. He was like the Gandhi of gangsters in his own mind. But he did, in fact, hurt somebody. 60 years ago, as a fugitive, Sutton was spotted on the subway despite wearing a disguise, despite having had plastic surgery when that was the stuff of science fiction, by a sweet kid, a 24-year-old from Brooklyn named Arnie Schuster, who was just out of the Coast Guard, fanatic Dodgers fan, crime buff. And he spotted Sutton on the train and pointed him out, followed Sutton off the train and pointed him out to a couple of patrol cops. And within minutes, the most wanted fugitive in America was in custody, and Arnie Schuster was the most famous Good Samaritan in American history. Sutton was such a folk hero that, as Kirsty said, huge crowds gathered outside the jail and chanted his name while death threats began to rain down on the little house in Brooklyn where Arnie lived with his mom and his dad and his younger brother. 19 days later, right outside that house, Arnie was gunned down by a mysterious stranger. He was shot 4 times in the eyes and the groin. And the execution of Arnie Schuster was one of those terrible, searing crimes that stands apart. It changed this city, even though it's completely forgotten today. It changed the way we view so many things about crime. Informants, police protection. The police didn't protect Arnie because there was some sort of mix-up about whether the cops would get the credit for catching Willie Sutton or Arnie. This murder repulsed New Yorkers. It changed the way we thought about bank robbers and about Willie Sutton for at least a little while. No one was ever arrested in the Schuster murder, but most people now believe that the murder was ordered by a Brooklyn mobster who was simply one of those throngs of people who admired Willie Sutton and thus didn't care much for this Good Samaritan. Even colleagues of this mobster were repulsed by the killing, and they had an unwritten rule back then: never kill a civilian or a newspaperman, an excellent rule in my view. And this was one reason that these colleagues then ordered that this mobster himself be whacked, which is sort of the seed of The Godfather. All of this sprouting from Willie Sutton and Arnie Schuster riding the same subway one day in February 1952. So fast forward to October 1957, and now it's going to get really weird. So just try and hang with me because this is actually real. The mobster in question was lying in a blue chair at a barber shop on Park and 55th, which is now a Starbucks. You can go there and check it out today if you like. In walked two men who hosed the place with bullets. It's one of the most iconic mob hits in New York history. The mobster was dead before he fell out of the chair, but in one of the other chairs was a young man named Kelly Camerata, who had no connection with Willie Sutton, Arnie Schuster, the mob, and in this hail of gunfire, Kelly Camerata jumped up and ran around the corner to the offices of Capitol Records, and one of the first people to see him was a 19-year-old secretary. She looked up from her work, and here came Kelly Camerata with white as a ghost, with this sheet wrapped around him and shaving cream on his face. And he went running past her, and she never forgot the look of terror in this poor man's eyes. 2 weeks later, Kelly Camerata vanished. 7 years later, that secretary had me. Her name is Dorothy Moehringer, none of which I knew until I started working on this book. So one day over coffee, I was telling my mother about this book and why the hell did I pick this book, and I'm lost, I don't know how to structure it, I can't get in the head of this bank robber, and it leads to this serpentine trail, I don't know how to get this mob hit in, which comes 5 years later, and I'm telling her all about this mob hit, and she is getting a look on her face, and she said, I know all about that mob hit, I was there. Well, I mean, my mom makes Donna Reed look like Courtney Love. So when your mom says, I was there, it's, coffee cup drops, jaw drops. I felt at that moment as if someone in a sheet had just run past me. Until then, my mother also never knew that mob hit had anything to do with Willie Sutton. So it's not really possible that she could have told me that story. Also, I know my mother's stories. If she had told me that she was at a mob hit, I would have remembered that. But so we both taught each other something really terrifying and crazy that morning, and until that moment, I was writing a historical novel, but now I wasn't. I was writing this novel where I had this vague and visceral connection all at the same time. And it felt all the more visceral because I discovered it after choosing the book. And all my cold, logical reasons for choosing to write Sutton suddenly felt like smoke. I felt as if this book had chosen me, as if it had spotted me in the crowd the way Schuster spotted Sutton. And that may seem ridiculous, but it's no more ridiculous than my mother wandering into a real-life Sopranos episode 51 years before I put it into a novel. Years ago, the great William Kennedy wrote a brilliant novel about Legs Diamond, who was an associate of Willie Sutton's. Great Irish gangster, bootlegger. And in an interview later, Kennedy said that just after he finished the novel, his wife had a dream that Legs knocked at their front door and said, "Tell Billy you got it right." And on the one hand, I really don't want to have an experience like that. I do not want, if they're listening, to hear from Willie Sutton or Kelly Camerata or Arnie Schuster. But on the other hand, I feel as if I already have. And I feel them sort of laughing over my shoulder when I tell people why I decided to write this book. You've all probably by now seen the viral video of the 80-year-old grandma who decides at the last minute that she doesn't want to go skydiving. Have you all? They interview her before the plane takes off, and she says, "Oh yes, raring to go. This is something I've wanted to do for years." And she's red hot, she's gung-ho. Then they cut to Grandma on the plane, and she's crouched at the open door, goggles on, wind in her hair, the instructor strapped to her back. Have you seen this video? Am I telling you something? And no, she does not want, she's changed her mind. She's clinging for dear life to that door. But the instructor, for whatever reason, won't let Grandma change her mind. I'm sorry if I'm telling you about something you've already seen, but I really haven't been able to stop talking about this since last week when I saw it. So this heartless bastard peels Grandma's fingers off the door and pulls and pushes her out of the plane. My voice is shaking as I'm thinking about it. They go spinning through the air, and now she's fighting off the instructor like he's a mugger trying to take her purse. And this is the part of the video where I really watch it through my fingers and my legs turn to jello. With the earth hurtling towards them, their tandem harness comes loose, and now she's hanging upside down, her underpants showing, while the instructor is trying desperately to hold onto what appears to be her bra or girdle, spank, some undergarment from the 19th century. You should really Google this. If any of this is news to you, please promise me that in fact, I see some of you Googling it right now on your iPads. I'll wait. Go ahead. To me, that's the single greatest metaphor for writing a book. There has never been, and there never will be. If anyone ever asks me, what's the writing process like? Just go to YouTube, plug in 80-year-old grandma skydiver. I don't have Zadie's gift for describing I don't need it. Go to YouTube. You think you're in control. You think you chose the book, the voice, the characters' names. You start out red hot, gung-ho. People interview you before you start. But at the pivotal moment, something at your back pushes or pulls you. Some heartless bastard peels your fingers off the door. And something like that had better happen to you, because if it doesn't, you probably don't have a book. Suddenly you find yourself upside down, hanging by your underpants. And having just last week landed in a tandem harness with Sutton and Schuster, I can tell you that whether you're a first-time novelist or an 80-year-old grandmother, whatever story you're telling or trying to tell, or whatever story you're reading for that matter, in whatever form, sometimes the best thing to do is not fight it. Don't overthink it. Relax and enjoy the ride. And that is maybe what I will tell Violet the next time I see her. Thank you.